Her true story from Kentucky. "We don't owe you anything." She yelled, so I packed up quietly and took the house. The humid Kentucky air hung thick and sweet with the smell of freshly cut grass and my daughter Ashley's expensive perfume, kind that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. It was a Saturday in late June, the kind of day made for porch swings and sweet tea. But we were standing in the backyard that Ashley had landscaped with cold stone tiles and minimalist furniture that looked like it belonged in a city art gallery, not a home with roots deep in bluegrass soil. She was hosting a barbecue for her and her husband, David's friends, people with clean hands and loud opinions, the kind who talked about their stock portfolios while I refilled the chip bowl and pretended I didn't exist. There was Margaret, David's boss's wife, a woman squeezed into a too bright yellow dress that made her look like an overripe banana. She kept checking her phone and sighing dramatically about her exhausting spa appointments. Then there was Kevin, a young colleague of David's who nervously tugged at his designer tie every few minutes while bragging about his new Tesla. The whole group had that particular brand of arrogance that comes from never having worked with your hands or wondered if you could afford groceries this week. My name is Clara, and for the last 5 years, since my husband Bob passed, my world had been shrinking like a wool sweater in hot water. I was a ghost in my own home, a silent engine of domestic labor that kept their perfect lives running smoothly while they collected compliments for hosting such wonderful gatherings. I'd spent the last 2 days preparing for this barbecue. My arthritic hands had rolled out the dough for Bob's favorite derby pie 3 times until I got the crust just right, flaky and golden with that secret splash of good Kentucky bourbon that made people close their eyes and sigh with pleasure. I made potato salad from a recipe my own mother had taught me on a sweltering summer day when I was just 16, standing in her tiny kitchen with the windows thrown open and the radio playing softly. I grilled the chicken with a marinade I'd perfected over 40 years of marriage, the same one that had made Bob propose to me after our 3rd date because, as he said, any woman who can make chicken taste like heaven is wife material. Now I moved through the crowd like a waitress in an expensive restaurant, carrying a heavy tray of iced tea in mason jars, the only concession Ashley had made to authentic Kentucky charm. The condensation dripped onto my worn hands that had kneaded thousands of loaves of bread, changed countless diapers, and held Bob's face when he took his last breath. One of David's colleagues, a middle-aged man named Richard with kind eyes and a slight paunch, took a long sip of the tea and let out a genuine sigh of pleasure. "Clara, this is the best sweet tea I've had in years. My grandmother used to make it like this. You have a magic touch." He turned to the small group gathered around him. "And that pie, good Lord, where did you learn to bake like that?" Before I could even smile or feel that warm flutter of pride that comes from honest appreciation, Ashley, who had been holding court by the new gas grill that cost more than my monthly widow's pension, let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. It was a sound designed to cut, practiced, and cruel. "Oh, that's just Mom," she said, waving a perfectly manicured hand in my direction, as if I were an amusing pet. "She lives with us. It's the least she can do to help out, you know." Her voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected, sweet on the surface but poisonous underneath, like antifreeze. The group fell into an uncomfortable silence. Richard shifted his weight, clearly sensing the cruelty in her words. "Well," he said carefully, "you're lucky to have her. This pie is a work of art. And this garden," he gestured toward the herb patch I'd maintained, despite Ashley's complaints about it being too rustic, "it's beautiful." That's when Ashley turned, her smile tightening into something that would have made a rattlesnake proud. She looked right at me, but she was performing for her audience, making sure every word landed like a slap. "Lucky, please." She let out another one of those cutting laughs. "We give her a roof over her head, a place to stay. We don't owe you anything," she snapped, her voice carrying across the patio and silencing every conversation. The words weren't just spoken, they were thrown like stones, meant to wound and humiliate. She should be grateful we haven't put her in a home yet. The chatter stopped dead. The clinking of glasses paused mid-air. Margaret's mouth fell open in shock. Kevin suddenly found his shoes fascinating. In the sudden, mortifying silence, I could hear the buzz of a lone cicada in the old oak tree Bob and I had planted when Ashley was just 7 years old, the same tree where she'd built fairy houses and where Bob had pushed her on the tire swing until his arms ached. I stood there, holding the empty tray, feeling the eyes of a dozen strangers on me. They weren't looking at me with pity that would have been bearable. They were looking at me with the awkward horror of people witnessing a public execution of dignity, the kind of second-hand embarrassment that makes you want to disappear into the ground. David, my son-in-law, who had once called me the best mother-in-law a guy could ask for, suddenly found the pattern on his expensive loafers intensely fascinating. No one defended me. No one said a word. But I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I didn't do what Ashley expected me to do, which was shrink away in shame and accept my place as the family charity case. Instead, a strange, cold clarity washed over me like the moment before a storm when the air goes still and electric. I looked at my daughter, this woman I had raised, whose fevers I had nursed through countless sleepless nights, whose skin knees I had kissed better, whose heartbreaks I had mended with homemade cookies and patient listening, and I saw a stranger. A cruel stranger who believed I was a burden they were graciously carrying, an unwanted guest in the very house my blood, sweat, and tears had built from the ground up. I turned without a word, walked back into the kitchen where the walls still held the faint smell of the cinnamon rolls I'd baked that morning, and began to plan. They thought I was a helpless old woman with nowhere to go, a freeloader dependent on their generosity. They were about to find out I was the foundation they were standing on, and foundations can be removed. Bob and I bought this place in 1985, two young dreamers with calloused hands and hearts full of hope. It wasn't much a rundown 2-story farmhouse on 10 acres of neglected land just outside of Lexington. The paint was peeling like a bad sunburn, the front porch was sagging under the weight of too many Kentucky winters, and the floors creaked a sad, lonely song with every step. The kitchen faucet dripped constantly, and the upstairs bathroom had wallpaper from the 1960s that looked like it had been designed by someone having a psychedelic breakdown. But it had good bones, as Bob used to say, running his carpenter's hands along the solid oak beams. "Clara, honey, look at this craftsmanship. They don't build them like this anymore." We were young, married for 10 years, and had saved every penny from his job at the Woodford Reserve Distillery and my job as a secretary at the elementary school. We didn't have a fancy wedding with ice sculptures and orchestra music like Ashley did. We had a simple ceremony at the county courthouse with just our parents and Bob's best friend Jimmy as witness, and we used every dollar we'd saved for the down payment on this dream. I remember that first summer like it was yesterday. We spent our weekends stripping layers of ancient wallpaper, laughing until our sides hurt when a particularly stubborn piece got stuck in Bob's thick brown hair. The work was backbreaking, but we were building something together, creating our piece of the American dream with nothing but determination and love. Bob promised me a porch swing where we could grow old together, watching the fireflies dance on summer nights and listening to the gentle rustle of corn in our neighbor's field. He built that swing with his own hands the following spring, sanding each slat until it was smooth as silk and painting it the soft blue I'd picked out from a magazine. Our daughter Ashley was just 6 years old when we moved in, a gap-toothed little girl with pigtails and scraped knees who thought our fixer-upper was a castle. She learned to ride her bike on the long gravel driveway, wobbling and giggling while Bob ran alongside her, his hand steady on her back. She helped me plant our first vegetable garden, her little hands covered in rich Kentucky soil as she carefully placed tomato seedlings in their rows. "Will they really grow food, Mama?" she'd asked, her eyes wide with wonder. That house wasn't just wood and nails and mortgage payments. It was a living record of our life together, a place where memories soaked into the walls like sunlight. It saw scraped knees kissed better in the kitchen, report cards celebrated with ice cream on the front porch, first dates nervously announced at the dinner table, and sleepless nights when Ashley had fever or nightmares. It held the echo of Bob's deep laughter when he watched football games, the sound of my humming while I cooked Sunday dinner, and the faint comforting smell of his Old Spice aftershave that never quite left his closet even years after he was gone. When Bob had his heart attack in 2015, it was sudden and cruel. One minute he was telling me a silly joke in the kitchen while I made his morning coffee something about a chicken and a bartender that wasn't even funny but made me laugh because of the way he wiggled his eyebrows. The next minute, he was clutching his chest, his face gray with pain. I held his hand in the ambulance, watched the paramedics work, and prayed to every saint I could remember from my Catholic childhood. But sometimes prayers aren't enough, and sometimes the people we love leave us before we're ready to let them go. The house became too quiet after that, too large for one grieving woman rattling around in rooms full of memories. Grief filled every corner like smoke, making it hard to breathe. The silence was deafening. No more of Bob's morning whistling, no more football games turned up too loud, no more of his terrible singing in the shower. I'd catch myself setting 2 plates for dinner or buying his favorite cereal out of habit, then remembering with a fresh stab of pain that he wouldn't be coming home. A year later, Ashley and David approached me with what they called the perfect solution. Ashley sat me down at the kitchen table where she'd done her homework as a child, her voice dripping with practiced concern. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone out here. What if something happens? What if you fall? We worry about you all the time." David nodded earnestly, playing his part perfectly. "It makes sense financially too, Clara. We'll help with the upkeep, and it'll save us a fortune on rent. We can be a real family again." I was lonely and tired of the crushing silence, tired of eating dinner alone while the evening news droned in the background. I said yes, thinking I was getting my family back, thinking I was giving my daughter and her husband a helping hand while gaining some company in my empty house. Instead, I had invited invaders into my sanctuary, wolves in designer clothing who saw my vulnerability as an opportunity. The changes started small, subtle enough that I told myself I was being oversensitive. Bob's favorite armchair, the brown leather recliner, where he'd watched 30 years of Kentucky basketball games, was suddenly donated to charity because it didn't match Ashley's modern farmhouse aesthetic. My hand-sewn quilts, each one a labor of love that had taken months to complete, were packed away and replaced with gray, textureless throws that looked like they came from a catalog page titled Soulless Living. The herb garden I'd tended for decades was criticized as messy and too rustic. Ashley wanted it replaced with decorative stones and hostas. "It's about curb appeal, Mom. We need this place to look sophisticated." My cooking, once praised and requested by everyone who knew me, was suddenly criticized for being too heavy and outdated. The kitchen where I'd created thousands of meals became a place where I felt like an intruder, tiptoeing around Ashley's rules about approved ingredients and appropriate seasonings. Slowly but surely, I became the unpaid maid, cook, and gardener in my own home. I was expected to maintain their lifestyle while becoming invisible in the process. If they had friends over, I was the silent servant refilling drinks and cleaning up messes. If they went out for the evening, I was the house sitter who made sure everything was perfect for their return. When Ashley's book club met in my living room, I was expected to provide refreshments and then disappear upstairs so I wouldn't embarrass her with my old-fashioned ways. The breaking point came about a month ago, on a Tuesday morning when the sun was streaming through the kitchen windows and I was making pancakes, real ones, from scratch, not the frozen kind Ashley preferred. Ashley came down the stairs in her expensive silk robe, her phone already glued to her ear as she discussed some business opportunity with someone who was obviously more important than her aging mother. She ended her call and turned to me with that bright, fake smile she'd perfected. "Mom, we need you to do us a huge favor," she said, her voice too sweet, like artificial sweetener that leaves a bitter aftertaste. She had a stack of official-looking papers in her hand and a pen that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "David and I want to start a business, a high-end cycling studio, like SoulCycle but more exclusive. We found the perfect location, and we have investors lined up." She set the papers down on the kitchen table where I'd helped her with algebra homework 20 years ago. "The bank said we could use the house as collateral for the startup loan. We just need you to sign ownership over to us. It's really just a formality since we live here anyway and handle all the bills." I looked at her, then at the papers that would sign away the only thing Bob and I had ever truly built together, the only security I had left in this world. The house where we'd planned to grow old together, where every room held memories more precious than gold. "No," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest. Her face twisted into an expression I'd never seen before, something ugly and entitled that made her look like a stranger. "What do you mean, no? Mom, it's just a piece of paper. We live here. We pay for everything anyway." Her voice was rising, taking on that shrill quality it had when she was a teenager and didn't get her way. "I pay the property taxes," I reminded her softly, thinking of the modest checks I wrote from my small widow's pension, the only financial contribution I was allowed to make. "And this house is in my name. It was your father's legacy to me, the only thing I have left of our life together. I'm not signing it away for your business venture." The fight that followed was brutal and revealing. Ashley accused me of being selfish, of holding her back, of not trusting her judgment. She said things that night that I knew she could never take back, words that severed something between us that had been fraying for years. "You're just bitter because Daddy's gone and you can't accept that this is our life now," she screamed. "You're living in the past, holding on to a dead man's memory while the rest of us are trying to move forward." That was the anger that simmered beneath her skin for weeks afterward. That was the resentment that finally boiled over in front of her friends at the barbecue, when she thought she could break me with public shame and humiliation. She thought I had nowhere to go, no power to fight back, no resources beyond what she chose to give me. She forgot about the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed, the one that held more than just memories. That night, after the last guest had left and the house fell into its artificial quiet, I waited until I could hear Ashley and David's muffled arguing through their bedroom wall. They were fighting about money, about the cycling studio, about whether they should try to force me into a nursing home. Their voices carried the panic of people who'd built their dreams on someone else's foundation and were just now realizing how unstable their position really was. I went to my room, knelt on the hardwood floor that Bob had refinished himself, and opened the cedar chest with hands that were surprisingly steady. The smell of cedar and memories filled the Army wedding dress wrapped in tissue paper, Bob's old Army uniform from his brief stint in the National Guard, letters we'd written to each other during our courtship, and photographs of a life well lived. Beneath all the sentimental treasures, there was a heavy manila envelope sealed with packing tape. I pulled out the deed with fingers that remembered signing it 35 years ago, when we were young and broke and so proud to own something real. The original document, pristine and legal and undeniable. It listed one owner in clear, official type, Clara Mae Jennings, my name, alone. No co-signers, no joint ownership, no fine print that gave anyone else claim to my home. I didn't pack a suitcase that night. I didn't leave a note or make a dramatic speech. Instead, I made a phone call to Arthur Schmidt, a lawyer Bob had known since they were boys growing up on neighboring farms. Arthur was old now, well past retirement age, but his mind was sharp as ever and his sense of justice was uncompromising. "Arthur, it's Clara Jennings, Bob's wife." My voice was calm, steady as bedrock. "Clara, how are you holding up, honey? I was just thinking about you and Bob the other day." "I need your help, Arthur. I need to evict some tenants." The next morning, I drove into Lexington in Bob's old pickup truck, the one Ashley had been pestering me to sell because it was an eyesore in the driveway. I met Arthur at his small, cluttered office above the hardware store where he'd practiced law for 40 years. He was waiting for me with coffee in mismatched mugs and the kind of righteous anger that comes from watching good people get taken advantage of. I laid the deed on his polished desk, the wood worn smooth by decades of important conversations and life-changing documents. "She thinks she owns it," I said, my voice steady as granite. "She told me yesterday that I was a burden they were carrying, that they don't owe me anything. She said this in front of a dozen people, Arthur. She humiliated me in my own backyard." Arthur read the document slowly, his eyes growing harder with each line. When he looked up at me over his reading glasses, his expression was grim but determined. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of legal experience. "Legally speaking, your daughter and her husband are tenants living in your property without a lease. You have every right to evict them, and given what you've told me about their behavior, I think you absolutely should." He pulled out a legal pad and began writing immediately, his pen scratching across the paper with purpose. "I'll draw up a formal notice to vacate right now. 30 days is the standard, but given the circumstances, we can make it ironclad. They'll have no legal recourse, no way to fight this." I watched him work, this old man who remembered when handshake deals meant something and treating your elders with respect wasn't optional. "Are you sure about this, Clara? Once we serve these papers, there's no going back. Your relationship with your daughter will never be the same." I thought about Ashley's face when she'd humiliated me, the cruel satisfaction in her eyes when she'd reduced me to nothing in front of strangers. I thought about Bob, who would have been appalled by his daughter's behavior, who had raised her to be better than this. "Arthur," I said quietly, "I think that relationship died yesterday. I'm just making it official." He drew up the papers right then and there, each word chosen carefully to leave no room for argument or appeal. A formal, legally binding notice to vacate that gave them 30 days to remove themselves and all their belongings from my property. It was cold, impersonal, and absolutely final, exactly what the situation required. I paid Arthur his fee, called a courier service, and had the papers delivered that very afternoon while I was safely away from the house. Then I drove to a small, clean, extended-stay hotel on the outskirts of town, paid for a month in advance with cash I'd been saving from my pension, and turned my phone to silent. I needed distance and peace to watch the storm I was about to unleash. The first call came at 9:15 the next morning, just as I was finishing my coffee and watching the sunrise through my hotel window. Then another at 9:20, and another at 9:30. By noon, I had 17 missed calls from Ashley, 12 from David, and even one from David's mother, who had apparently been dragged into the drama. Finally, a voicemail appeared. I pressed play, holding the phone away from my ear, as if it might bite me. "Mom? Mom, what is this? What kind of sick joke is this?" Ashley's voice was shrill with panic, all her usual composure stripped away. "You got some lawyer to send us an eviction notice? From our own house? Are you losing your mind? This has to be illegal. David is looking it up right now, and he says you cannot do this to us. We have rights. Call me back right now. This isn't funny, this is insane." Her voice wasn't just angry, it was laced with pure, unfiltered panic, the sound of someone's world crumbling beneath their feet. The sound of someone realizing that the burden they'd been carrying was actually the pillar holding up their entire life. I deleted the message without a flicker of emotion, feeling nothing but a cold satisfaction that justice was finally being served. For the next week, the calls and messages continued, each one more desperate than the last. Ashley tried anger, then bargaining, then tearful apologies. David left messages about working this out like adults and finding a compromise. His mother called to lecture me about family obligations and Christian forgiveness. I listened to none of them, deleted each message as it arrived, and enjoyed the first peace I'd had in years. Through a neighbor I trusted, I heard that they had hired a lawyer of their own, some expensive attorney from Louisville who specialized in real estate disputes. He'd likely told them the grim truth within hours. They had no legal standing whatsoever. The house was mine, period. Their only option was to leave quietly or be forcibly removed by the sheriff's department. The day they were supposed to be out, exactly 30 days after the papers were served, I was sitting in my new, small apartment that I'd rented with my first month's hotel stay coming to an end. It was tiny compared to the farmhouse, just 2 rooms and a kitchenette, but it was mine. No one could tell me what to cook or how to decorate or whether my belongings matched their aesthetic vision. I was watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple, feeling something I'd almost forgotten existed: peace. There was a soft knock on my door. Through the peephole, I could see Ashley standing in the hallway. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of all her confidence and entitlement. Her face was pale and blotchy from crying, her expensive clothes wrinkled, her perfect hair unwashed and hanging limp around her shoulders. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. I didn't open the door. Instead, I spoke through the intercom system, my voice calm and clear. "What do you want, Ashley?" Her voice cracked like thin ice. "Mom, please let me in. We need to talk. We have nowhere to go. All our stuff is in a storage unit we can barely afford. David's mother won't let us stay there. She says we brought this on ourselves. I'm sorry, okay? I'm so sorry for what I said. Please, don't do this to us. Don't throw away your only family over one stupid fight." I thought of Bob, of our life together, of the love and sacrifice that had built the home she'd treated like her personal hotel. I thought of all the meals I'd cooked, all the laundry I'd folded, all the ways I'd made myself small and invisible so she could feel important. I thought of her words, hanging in the humid Kentucky air like poison. "We don't owe you anything." "You were right, Ashley," I said into the intercom, my voice as calm and clear as a winter morning. "You don't owe me anything. You made that very clear in front of all your friends. And now we're even. Now I don't owe you anything either." I turned off the intercom and walked away from the door, not looking back even when I heard her crying in the hallway. I didn't listen for her footsteps as she finally left. I didn't need to. In the quiet of my new beginning, surrounded by the few possessions that truly mattered to me, Bob's photograph, my mother's recipe box, the quilt I'd made for our 10th anniversary, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Freedom, peace, the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, justice isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes, it's the quiet click of a lock on a new door. Sometimes it's the rustle of legal papers that set you free from people who never deserved your love in the first place. My silence through those 30 days hadn't been weakness, it had been me sharpening the truth like a blade, preparing to cut away the rot before it could destroy what was left of my dignity. They'd mistaken my grief for helplessness, my kindness for stupidity, my love for obligation. They'd forgotten that the quietest women often have the loudest victories. 3 months later, I heard through the neighbor that Ashley and David had moved to Florida, where his company had transferred him to a lower-paying position. They'd sold most of their belongings to afford the move, including Ashley's jewelry and David's precious sports car. The cycling studio dream had died with their eviction, along with any pretense that they were successful, independent adults. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, no joy in their reduced circumstances. I simply felt nothing. The cord that had bound me to my daughter's happiness had been severed cleanly that day at the barbecue, and I'd discovered that I could live quite well without the constant weight of their expectations and cruelty. My new life was smaller but richer. I volunteered at the local food bank, where my cooking skills were appreciated and my life experience was valued. I joined a book club at the library where women my age talked about literature and life without anyone telling us we were too old or too set in our ways. I planted herbs in window boxes and made friends with my elderly neighbors, people who understood that respect is earned and love should never come with conditions. And on warm evenings, I would sit on the small balcony of my apartment with a cup of tea, watching the fireflies dance in the dusk and remembering Bob's promise about growing old together. He might not be physically beside me, but his love had given me the strength to reclaim my life from people who would have drained every drop of joy from it. If you've ever been made to feel small in a space you built with your own hands, if you've ever had your love and labor taken for granted by the very people who should treasure it most, if your own family has ever looked you in the eye and told you that your presence was a burden rather than a blessing, then you know that justice isn't always served hot. Sometimes it's ice cold, patient as winter, and sharp as a blade honed to perfection. My daughter thought she could break me with shame and public humiliation. She thought I was too old, too weak, too dependent to fight back. She forgot that I was the woman who'd helped build a life from nothing, who'd survived loss and betrayal and kept going anyway. She forgot that I was Bob Jennings' wife, and Bob Jennings never raised a quitter. Justice served cold is still justice, and sometimes the quietest revenge is simply taking back what was always yours and walking away with your head held high. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories, because here we know that age doesn't make us weak, it makes us wise. And wisdom, properly applied, is the most powerful weapon of all. We don't get mad, we get what's ours, and we sleep peacefully knowing we've earned every bit of it.